conversations about public humanities in the UK and to advance the value of the humanities at a time when public interest is rising, even as their place in the higher education sector, research system, and wider culture is growing more precarious. We are thrilled that our speaker tonight, Elif Shafak, will become one of our Public Humanities Fellows. And I'm delighted to announce that Elif will be joined this year by 5 other superb Public Humanities Fellows from a range of disciplinary backgrounds. Naomi Alderman, who is the author of several novels, including the best-selling multi-award-winning The Power. She is also the co-creator of Zombies Run, a fitness game and audio adventure with more than 10 million players. And she writes and presents Human Intelligence, A History of Thinking on BBC Radio 4. Susanna Lipscomb is an award-winning historian, author, and broadcaster who has written and edited 7 books, including The King is Dead, The Last Will and Testament of Henry VIII, and presented numerous history documentary series across the BBC, ITV, More 4, and Channel 5. She is also the host of Not Just the Tudors, a podcast from History Hit. Hallie Rubenhold is a best-selling author, social historian, broadcaster, and historical consultant for television and film. She is the author of several works of fiction and nonfiction, including The Five, Reframing the Murders of Jack the Ripper Through a Feminist Lens. The Five was an international bestseller, shortlisted for the Wolfson History Prize, and won the Baillie Gifford Prize for nonfiction. Ritala Shah is a journalist and broadcaster who presents Calm Classics every weekday evening on Classic FM, and who for more than a decade was the main presenter of The World Tonight, Radio 4's evening news program, with a focus on international affairs and British politics. Matthew Sweet is a writer and broadcaster with 25 years of television and radio experience, and a presenter of Free Thinking on BBC Radio 4. He is the author of several works of history, including most recently Operation Chaos, and he is also the co-writer with Mark Gaddis of Bookish. They join our existing fellows, Karenza Lewis, David Olashoga, Adam Rutherford, Lindsay Stonebridge, and Erica Wagner, all of whom are champions of public humanities in their fields and are here to work with us to strengthen our work in the humanities across civil society. So join me, please, in welcoming them all. And it is now my great pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening. Tonight we gather to reaffirm the place of the humanities in shaping public conversations, particularly at a moment when those conversations often feel both relentless and inflammatory. We have hundreds joining us here in person in Senate House tonight, and almost 1,000 people joining us online right now across the globe, which is a heartening sign of continued interest in the questions the humanities are asking about our society and our world. This lecture comes as we mark another year of dynamic scholarship amid geopolitical turbulence and cultural reckonings, and as we enter 2026, which has been declared the year of reading, so it's particularly apt. That designation invites us to think about reading not only as a private pleasure, but as a public practice, one that trains attention, patience, and interpretive care, helping us embrace complexity and pluralism. If democracy depends on more than competing slogans, if it depends on the capacity to listen, to argue in good faith, and to imagine lives unlike our own, then reading and the habits it cultivates can only strengthen our civic life. It is hard to imagine a more fitting speaker in this context than Elif Shafak, the award-winning British-Turkish novelist who has published 21 books, 13 of them novels, translated into 58 languages, whose work is itself a form of public thinking. Her novels include The Island of Missing Trees, a finalist for the Costa Award, British Book Awards, RSL Ondaatje Prize, and the Women's Prize for Fiction, as well as a Reese Witherspoon Book Club pick, a reminder of the extraordinary range of readers her work reaches, from prize juries to millions of people from all walks of life worldwide. 10 minutes, 38 seconds in This Strange World was shortlisted for the Booker Prize, The 40 Rules of Love recognized by the BBC among the 100 novels that shaped our world, The Architect's Apprentice chosen for the Queen's Reading Room, and her latest international bestseller, There Are Rivers in the Sky. Her work crosses borders of language, nation, history, and genre, and she consistently urges the value of multiplicity in an age that too often treats complexity as a problem to be solved. Through fiction and nonfiction alike, she has written with particular force about exile, identity, women's lives, and minority experience, making a sustained case without sentimentality for what cultural encounter can still make possible. Elif holds a PhD in political science and has taught at universities in Turkey, the US, and the UK, including University of Oxford, where she is an honorary fellow. She also holds an honorary doctorate of humane letters from Bard College in New York. Shafak is president of the Royal Society of Literature and has been chosen among BBC's 100 most inspiring and influential women. In 2024, she was awarded the British Academy President's Medal for her body of work and its intercultural range. To welcome Elif Shafak as our 2026 National Humanities Lecturer is both an honor and an opportunity to think with her about how the public life of ideas is formed, defended, and renewed. Please join me in warmly welcoming Elif Shafak to deliver this year's National Humanities Lecture.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for every beautiful word that you shared with us. And thank you so much for being here. I'm also very much looking forward to your questions afterwards. If anything I say doesn't make sense, please share it with me. So let's turn it into a dialogue. And I'm hoping we're going to have time for that. Now, if you'll allow me, I would like to begin by sending a little salute to a writer I loved reading in my youth, a writer whose work captured and sparked my imagination and really kept me company in an otherwise lonely childhood. This was the French novelist, poet, and playwright Jules Verne, born in 1828. He is still to this day one of the most widely translated authors in the world, and he is generally regarded as the father of science fiction. Among his most famous works, as you know, are Around the World in 80 Days, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, or Journey to the Center of the Earth. Now, it's profoundly interesting that the themes that Jules Verne dealt with in his fiction, things that were regarded bizarre, surreal, or just simply impossible at the time, they became a reality later on, and with such precision that some people today call him the writer who invented the future. So, for instance, he imagined submarines far beyond the limitations of his era. He predicted TV news, skyscrapers, glass skyscrapers. He predicted weapons of mass destruction, high-speed trains, cars with combustion engines, elaborate subway systems, cities illuminated by electricity, fax machines, and something eerily similar to the internet, machines communicating with each other. He even predicted electronic music. Now, there's one book by Jules Verne which, unlike all of his works, remained unpublished, unknown, and unloved. He wrote this book in 1863 and named it Paris in the 20th Century. It is a dystopian novel about what France or Europe or the wider world, one might say, would look like in 100 years' time, right? And he predicted that around 1960s and from that moment onwards, the world would be dominated by business, technology, finance, commerce. It would be a society, it would be a world shaped by increasing mechanization and accelerating automation. The protagonist in his story is a young man, is a young aspiring poet who studies classical literature. And on the day he graduates, actually he's very talented, he's very brilliant, but on the day he graduates, he's mocked and ridiculed because of the discipline that he has studied. And he realizes painfully that the skills that he has are considered useless in this new world. So Jules Verne envisioned a technocentric civilization where poetry was going to be pushed to the periphery. The humanities would have neither an appeal nor a place anymore. There would be no artistic creativity in the public space, and there would be a wave of rising anti-intellectualism. The relentless pursuit of profit and obsession with technological advancement would be so excessive that they would lead to a diminishing regard for literature, humanities, and the arts. This was the world that he sincerely worried about. When he finished his novel, he sent it to a publisher, and then he received a very harsh rejection letter. You see, the publisher did not like the story because he thought that the story that Jules Verne had written was too pessimistic. It was too bleak. Surely the next century could not be this dark. So the author, heartbroken, he put his novel away and tried to write more optimistic novels from that moment onwards. But it would take more than a century for this handwritten, forgotten novel or manuscript to see the light of the day. Only after his great-grandson coincidentally found it in a safe, and it was published, hence our knowledge of the story today. Now, Jules Verne is a remarkable thinker, of course, and he was spot on about many things. But I think there's one issue where he was wrong. And time proved him wrong, at least until so far. Writing in the early 1800s, as a novelist, he argued that in the next 50 to 100 years, as a genre, the novel could not survive, that fiction was going to disappear in the age of newspapers, because novels required their readers to concentrate, to focus, to embark on a journey with them. Whereas newspapers, on the other hand, they relied on brevity, speed, the constant churning cycle of news. So the question he asked then was, how could the long-form narrative remain alive in an age of fast consumption? Now, let's hold that thought in our minds for a while and gently leave Jules Verne in the 1800s, alone with his worries, alone with his dreams. Although we might draw a circle at the end of this talk and come back to him, because I think time is not linear. This is something quantum physicists and storytellers would agree on. It's an illusion to assume that time is a neat and strict line. It's an illusion to think that there will always be a steady march of progress from past to present to future. It's an illusion to assume that we will never ever make the mistakes that our great-grandparents had already made. So, time not being linear, there are movements back and forth, there are echoes, eddies, circles throughout history. Now, those of us in this room who are old enough, we will remember that throughout the 1980s, 1990s, the early noughties, and so on, we have seen, both in academia and media, article after article announcing the death of the novel. We have read so many essays claiming that the long prose was bound to wither away. Almost always, this assertion was based on the same rationale. In an age of fast consumption, hyperinformation, and instant gratification, who would have the time or the will to read a 400-page long novel? That was the verdict for a long time. But in truth, something very unexpected happened, and it is still happening. What we have seen in truth is a continuity, not a rupture. When we look at the data across the decades, fiction sales have been remarkably steady. And this is not solely a European or a Western phenomenon. Last year at the Frankfurt Book Fair, if you've seen the statistics, it's very interesting that there was almost a 30% increase in fiction sales in India, and among other territories where we have seen a robust growth in fiction sales are Brazil and Mexico. I'm not claiming that everybody is reading novels. Of course not, regrettably not. I'm not forgetting for a moment that reading habits across the world have declined, including, sadly, here in the UK, as demonstrated by a recent YouGov poll, which found out that 40% of the population had not read a book in the last 12 months. Nor do I deny the challenges that are presented by social media and shortening attention spans. But I still find it important not to miss the fact that among those who continue to read, a substantial percentage still choose and cherish the long form. 200 years after the birth of Jules Verne, in a world infatuated with speed, technology, commerce, finance, profit, material gain, much as he foresaw, in a world where we do not even have the patience to watch a video for longer than 10 seconds, there are still so many people valuing novels, valuing the long narrative. How do we explain this? I think what is happening is the faster our world spins, the more bewildering and confusing and lonely our age, the deeper and the more urgent our need to slow down, to connect with our fellow human beings, connect with nature, connect with ourselves, the deeper our need to reflect and to empathize. The art of storytelling is ancient, it is universal. It does not belong to a single race or religion or region or class. It belongs to all of us. We need stories to make sense of who we are, where we live, what we have, and what we will never have. Our need for stories, I believe, is as essential as our need for bread and water. But there's another reason why I wanted to focus on the longevity of novels or the long form ever since the time of Gilgamesh, for instance, because I think it's very relevant for our lecture today. Because just like the novel has been repeatedly declared dead in the past, the humanities are being declared dead today. We're being told that there should be fewer students in these disciplines. We're being told that there should be fewer scholars and definitely fewer scholarships. Instead, young people should be encouraged towards high-income disciplines, fields that suit the needs of this era. And when you hear people talk like that, it almost sounds as if they see humanities as a luxury item, you know, like a royal beluga caviar. I checked and couldn't believe my eyes when I saw that a tiny tub costs 500 pounds, you know? So they probably pair caviar and humanities, or maybe they value caviar more than the humanities. Some have even called the humanities a burden on the shoulders of taxpayers. Others have described it as a relic of a bygone era, something idyllic and romantic, but from another century, the 20th or the 19th century, a time when the world was a different place. So the question they're asking is, why study philosophy, spending your time thinking about thinking when you can be trained in one of the up-and-coming fields, the trending fields? Why be a loser, to use a popular term in today's politics, when you could be a winner? I will argue in this lecture that this blinkered approach has been hugely damaging, not only for the happiness of students, not only for the academia in general, but for the entire society and for the future of our democracies. A few years back, the New York Times ran a piece about the existential crisis of liberal arts departments across the US, emphasizing how they feared facing the chopping block and asking whether they would survive the impending budget cuts. Another article and study appeared last year highlighting how the National Endowment for the Humanities, which supports a wide canvas of knowledge from museums to scholarships, is experiencing alarming cuts in budget, grants, and staff. Here, maybe we can share another depressing statistics. In the 1960s, the share of humanities enrollments was around 18% in the US. more than 24% in the UK. Right now, it's around 7 to 8%. The numbers vary a little bit depending on which studies we focus, but one thing is clear, there has been a decline. Disciplines that bring in more revenue are regarded with more esteem, with more respect. Again, here in the UK, we have seen, sadly, politicians proposing that the entire higher education system should be restructured and university degrees that do not bring in money, which therefore are useless, should be re-evaluated. It's a polite way of saying they should be, chucked aside. It is, of course, pivotal, especially in this time of cost of living crisis, that every student be able to find a good and decent job. And we also need to respectfully stress the importance of STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and maths. There's no question that they're hugely significant, and there's nothing wrong about highlighting that. But what is wrong, what is not okay, is to reduce an entire and the holistic university experience and education into a suffocatingly narrow tunnel where there's only one goal, one possible direction: to make money. To be clear, the humanities are not dead. They are alive because they're resilient, because as long as human beings exist, there will always be an innocent curiosity and heartfelt passion for philosophy, for history, for languages, for literature, for arts. So the humanities are surviving, but they are not thriving. And the challenges that they're facing do not occur, do not happen in isolation. I think they're very much in tandem with what's happening across the broader society. A recent BBC analysis found out that more than 180 council-run libraries in the UK have been either completely closed or handed over since 2016. Now, the interesting thing is, while the funding to libraries is diminishing, in-person visits to libraries has been going up. So there is demand, but there's not enough support. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, as documented by PAN America meticulously, we have seen a surge in book bans, book removals, putting librarians, most of whom are introverts, book-loving, gentle souls, putting them in the front lines of a very tense and hostile confrontation. I think not even Jules Verne could have imagined that in the year 2026, a librarian's job would be among the most stressful and dangerous jobs in the world. So, in the last part of my talk, I want to broaden the focus and discuss what all of this means for civil society and for public space, but also for the future of our democracies. Until now, we have seen that in an environment where an artificial hierarchy is imposed on disciplines, and where the creative fields are pushed to the bottom of that hierarchy, in such an environment, whenever there is the slightest economic financial turbulence, governments and local authorities will and do cut funding for libraries, cultural centers, and youth centers, and so on. I think they should be doing the exact opposite, especially in a time of deepening and widening inequalities. We have to invest just the opposite. We have to invest more in the humanities, more in the cultural spaces. Sometimes we need to bear in mind that sometimes, many times, arts and culture are the only way a child, a young person from a disadvantaged background can go beyond the boundaries, beyond the boxes that we as a society have unfairly pushed them into. Music, sports, dance, theater, we need to invest in these fields passionately, especially in times of crisis and inequalities. I will also argue that cutting of funding for culture and humanities and the arts has actually deep social, cultural, but also political consequences. If you want a healthy, harmonious civil society, invest in the humanities and the arts. If you do not want a country that is horribly separated into communities that do not trust each other, that do not understand each other, a society shaped by paranoia and constant othering, than invest in the arts and the humanities. Now, along those lines, in 2010, a very important book was published by the American philosopher Martha Nussbaum. It's called Not for Profit: Why Democracy Needs the Humanities. And I would say if this book was relevant back then, I think it's all the more relevant today. Nussbaum shows that not only literature and philosophy have changed the world, but that humanities are essential for the development and prosperity of the public space. She says, critical thinking and reflection are crucial in keeping democracies alive and wide awake. And the ability to imagine the experience of another person, a capacity almost all human beings possess in some form, that capacity needs to be greatly enhanced and refined if we are to have any hope of sustaining decent institutions across the many divisions that any modern society contains today. So she wrote those lines 10 years to 15 years ago, and I think they have become all the more urgent today, that capacity to put ourselves in the shoes of another person. To be clear, empathy does not mean sympathy. Empathy doesn't mean pity. I like the Germanic root of the English word empathy, einfühlung, which basically means feeling into. You are journeying into the psychology of another person. And I think this is a very humbling exercise for the mind and for the soul. So when we read a novel for a few hours, for a few days, we do journey into the experience of another person. And then we realize the person that I regarded as my other is actually my brother, is actually my sister. I am the other. It dissolves those dualities. It's almost like a transcendental experience that allows us to abandon the castle of the ego for at least a little while. I think with more empathy comes more caring, and with more caring comes more engagement. If we have more citizens who are engaged and compassionate and caring, that means we will have more bridge builders. And if we have more bridge builders, we will have healthier democracies. Countries like my motherland, Turkey, have shown us that of course the ballot box is important. Of course elections are important, but that in itself is not enough to sustain a democracy. In addition to the ballot box, we need the rule of law, we need separation of powers, we need an independent academia, diverse and independent. We need diverse and independent media, we need women's rights, we need minority rights, and we need a robust, functioning civil society. If we do not have these components, but if we have only the ballot box, that system cannot be a democracy. At best, it will be majoritarianism. And from majoritarianism into authoritarianism, it's a very quick fall. When I was writing There Are Rivers in the Sky, I focused on the journey of a single drop of water. The reason I wanted to mention this with you is because as I was doing research for this book, I realized that out of the most 10 water-stressed nations in this world, 7 of them are in the Middle East and in North Africa. What that means basically is that our rivers are dying. Now, in our minds, we put water scarcity in a box. We put women's rights in another box, maybe racial inequality in another box. But when we look at how life evolves, in those places where there's water scarcity, and because women are water carriers, when there's no drinkable water, the distance that a young woman has to walk increases, unfortunately also increasing the danger of gender violence. I want to mention this because it shows us that everything in life is connected. We are all connected. Our destinies, our stories are all connected. So there are no mutually exclusive boxes. And when I look at my own life, I realize the times when I felt most nourished intellectually was always and always when I found diversity. What do I mean by that? When I met people from all walks of life, all backgrounds, but also when I focused on interdisciplinary studies, which allowed me to learn from multiple sources, multiple disciplines. I think the mind is always more nourished when we leave our comfort zones, you know, those atomized spaces. For instance, when a novelist becomes interested in neuroscience, I don't know anything about neuroscience, I'm curious, I want to learn, I become a student of that field. Or when a neuroscientist falls in love with poetry, or when a poet becomes interested in history, when a historian loves philosophy, and so on. Those are the moments when we are much more nurtured intellectually. I'm going to speed up just a little bit to give more time for the discussions, but a few things I want to add. I think in the age we're living, we are not being encouraged to be creatives, but mostly consumers. We're being told that we should be informed citizens, but there's so much emphasis on information that perhaps it's helpful to make a distinction, just like T.S. Eliot advised us to do, between information, knowledge, and wisdom. We live in an age in which we are bombarded by information. There's way too much information, but very little knowledge and even less wisdom. Information comes in snippets, in morsels, you know. We have no time to process it because just as we consume one, we move on to the next one. Whereas knowledge requires us to slow down. For knowledge, we need cultural spaces, literary festivals, discussions such as these. And I think for wisdom, we need the arts. We need to bring emotions and emotional intelligence into the discussion. We also need literature. Please don't get me wrong, I am not claiming that writers are wise people. I think we are a mess, you know, we're a big mess. But I am claiming that when we write, we tap into something that is bigger than us, that is older than us, and that is definitely wiser than us, and that is the ancient art of storytelling. So the humanities, the arts, literature, there's a lot we can and we do contribute, both in terms of the longevity of our democracies, but also in terms of this emotional moment that we're all experiencing. I deliberately use the word emotional because I think we're living in the age of angst. There's an existential anxiety right now that cuts so deep. East and West, young and old, so many people right now are actually very concerned and very worried. Maybe the only difference is some people hide their emotions or their anxieties more than others. But that is the only difference. At a moment like this, when we are struggling, too many of us are struggling, we need the humanities to help us, to guide us, and to make us feel less lonely. I also believe that the humanities will contribute a lot, particularly when it comes to discussions about AI, how to develop these new technologies in a much more responsible way, AI and ethics, machines and morality. There's a lot that we need to contribute in terms of this discussion. My point is technology is way too important to leave it to tech firms. If I may come back at the end to Jules Verne again, it's very interesting that his father was a very successful lawyer, and he wanted his son to be a successful lawyer too, so he sent him to a law school. And there's a very sweet story about, first of all, he was very miserable there and he always wanted to run away. But there's a very sweet story about how he was dreaming of becoming a cabin boy and join a ship and just sail away until his family found out. And then he had to promise his family that he would not go away, but he will journey in his imagination. Whether this is a true story or not, like every story, it hides inside a kernel of truth. And that truth is, if a child, if a young citizen, if a young person is interested in law, maths, science, computers, business, definitely encourage them in that direction. But if a child is an artist, if a child loves history, if a young person wants to study philosophy or literature, do not force them towards law or business or finance just because you think that it's more lucrative or more prestigious. Finally, in the journey to the center of the earth, there's a lovely passage when one of the characters says, I dream with my eyes open. I really like that expression a lot because it opens up a space for dreams, for imagination, for creativity. And then, as it does that, it opens up another space for observation, examination, research, understanding, and knowledge. I dream with my eyes open. And I think in an age like this, in the age of anxiety, in the age of angst, if we want to be able to dream, continue to dream with our eyes open, we definitely need the help of the humanities. Thank you so much for listening.
As Elise said, she's now going to take questions. We've had a little technical glitch and we don't have roving mics, so I'm the roving mic. So what's going to happen is if you do have a question, we are just going to ask you to shout it out, but then so that people online and for the recording that everybody can hear it, I'll be repeating the question and then Elise will answer. So sorry for the relay race, but I'm sure we can all get there. Any questions or thoughts? Right here in the front.
I just wanted to thank you for the lecture. It was really beautiful. And my name is Mancha. It's very
Nice to meet you.
see you in person. I was recently reading The Erosion in the Sky, and as Arthur journeys into Nibenir, and I felt like I knew him in a way because the writing brings real life events and fictional characters and meshes them together into such a beautiful story. And I just wanted to ask you that how would you recommend in an age where attention spans are reducing and consumption is growing, that we continue to be creative? And for example, if we went to write and create stories, and do you have any advice for any new writers in this age?
So the question was about advice for writers in an age of reducing attention spans and people who are interested in engaging with creative work. So advice for new writers and also thoughts on how you are meshing the real world and the fictional in your work.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful, and such a universally important question. So I really appreciate that you raised it. You know, I gave two TED Talks, almost 10 years apart. The first time I was getting ready for my talk, I was told that I should keep my talk around about 19 minutes, 20 minutes. And 10 years later, they told me, well, you need to reduce it to 12 minutes. Now the guidelines have changed. And I asked, why is that why is the case? And they told me the average attention span worldwide had shrunk so much that now they were shortening the talks. And that really made me so sad, because are we not capable of just following a talk for more than 15 minutes? I think the brain is a muscle, empathy is a muscle as well. The more we use it, the better we become at it. The distinction that I mentioned very briefly between information, knowledge, and wisdom, that is something I passionately believe in. I think information really sucks our energy, and it makes us feel so tired, emotionally tired, because so much is happening. We can't follow it, we can't catch up with it, and it feels like we're so small. Like the world is so big, problems are so big, climate crisis is so big, wars, genocides are so big. I'm just a small person, what can I do? It makes us feel so small. So I believe we need to change our focus from information to knowledge. For instance, slow journalism, that's brilliant. Podcasts are amazing. Books, definitely. But cultural spaces such as these, we really do not have to agree on everything. We can disagree, but we have time for each other. We hear each other. These conversations are so important. So how do we spend our time? What do we focus on? I think is very important. And the other thing, if I may encourage you to do, please do write. Our stories matter. We didn't have much time to talk about this, but within the public space, I think the voices of women, young people, people from all backgrounds, that diversity, that multiplicity is incredibly important and healthy, both for individuals and for communities. Thank you.
Other questions? Gentlemen.
Thank you. Is artificial intelligence a blessing or a curse?
Wow.
Oh, a remarkably succinct question, and right to the point. Thank you. As the translator of the question, I thank you. The question is artificial intelligence a blessing or a curse for humanity?
Tough question. I wish I could, yeah, answer in just one word. If I may take you back in time a little bit, 1990s, early 2000s was a time of extreme optimism. And back then, the biggest optimists were techno optimists. And I remember, we were being told that if you spread digital technologies, democracy was going to spread everywhere. It was the end of authoritarianism. It was the triumph of liberal democracy. It was the end of history. So the mistake that was made back then was to trust too much in these new technologies without realizing that they also had a darker side. I am by no means underestimating the importance of artificial intelligence and technological advancements in general, particularly when it comes to medicine, lots of fields. It is incredibly promising and so important. We need to encourage that. But there's a darker side that we haven't talked about enough, particularly when it comes to misinformation, when it comes to hate speech, when it comes to how communities are being pulled apart. So we need to be very careful about those. And if I may add very quickly, I personally wouldn't want any human being, any political party, or any company, including any tech company, to have extreme power. It is not healthy. Again, we are humans, we need checks and balances. So this absolute monopolization of power is something that worries me. That's why I think in this debate about technology, we as citizens need to be involved. Many of us, in a very genuine way, we think, well, technology is too complicated. I don't know much about it, so it's not my place to talk. It is our place to talk. We have every right to ask questions. It is our future and the future of our children. So I find it very important that we engage in this conversation.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see you. Sorry.
You talked really briefly about how writing is learning and how learning is specific. And I was wondering if when writing any of your novels, you learn something you didn't expect.
Beautiful.
The question is about whether Elif learned anything she hasn't expected to learn in the course of writing her novels.
And I think my answer would be all the time, really, because I think books change us. I always feel like I'm a different person before I start writing a novel, and by the time you finish, something has shifted. I'm hoping books change their readers as well, you know? It helps me to learn so much about the world, but also to see it differently. One thing that is very crucial for me is to try to understand where are the silences, where are the voices that I do not hear. Not only focusing on the mainstream or the center, but trying to pay attention to the margins, to the periphery. Where are the forgotten stories? I mean, very briefly, I come from a country that, of course, has a very long and rich history, right? But that doesn't mean that we have a very strong memory. If anything, I think Turkey is a society of collective amnesia. Our entire relationship with the past is full of ruptures. And when you have a void like that, it's very easy to fill it in with imperial nostalgia, with ultranationalism and that kind of rhetoric. But then you ask seemingly small questions. Okay, you say, in this story of the empire, where are the stories of women? Where are the stories of minorities? Maybe an Armenian silversmith, maybe a Jewish miller, maybe an Arab peasant, or a Greek sailor. Where are their stories? And then there's a big silence. So the reason why I mention this is because this is a constant process of learning, but also unlearning. Sometimes we have to unlearn the biases that we inhale, we internalize without even being aware of it. Many of us, we're born into a small corner of the universe. We internalize so many biases about each other. So I think unlearning is an important part of learning.
I should try to be loud and concise. You talked a lot in your lecture about temporality and duration, and I was intrigued with both in the talk and in your answer to the first question. When you were talking about empathy, you described it as something which has a kind of duration. So going on a journey takes time, just as storytelling has a duration.
duration itself part of the value of the journey and the thinking.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think maybe I should also mention right away that I love poetry, I love short stories, I love the short form as well. And I believe that our reading list should be eclectic, actually. Let's read everything and anything that speaks to us. There's no such thing as highbrow literature versus lowbrow literature. Who even makes those distinctions, that kind of duality? The important thing is to make reading constant in our lives. So let's read cookbooks, let's read political philosophy, let's read graphic novels, but let's also read interculturally from all over the world, not just Eurocentric novels or Eurocentric literature. Um, Maybe the second part of your question is also very interesting. What is it about the long form that maybe speaks to me or is much closer to my heart? To be honest, when I am inside the canvas of a novel, I feel so free. In our daily lives, we're constantly maybe confined. We live in a world in which we are not allowed to bring out our own multiplicity, let alone celebrate it. Maybe no one said it better than Walt Whitman when he said, every human being, and he said, I contain multitudes. We all contain multitudes. But we live in a world in which we are put in a box and asked to stay in that box once and for all. Whereas when I'm writing, I feel like I can be multiple. I can journey into other people's existences. And if I can help the reader to make that journey as well, that would make me very happy. Because, as I mentioned very briefly, it's a good thing. It's almost mystical, it's almost like a spiritual, transcendental connection. The autobiographical aspect of literature has been emphasized a lot, and I respect it a lot. But there's another side to literature that we don't talk about enough, and that's the transcendental nature, in which we leave our zones or we leave our identity, the story of me, and we become someone else. That is what I find very close to my heart.
There was a question here in the front.
Firstly, I want to thank you for this lecture. It was wonderful, and
Thank
I really love the way you started by making this reference to children
Yeah.
and actually how influence your childhood.
Yeah.
I'm a lawyer by profession, and I became that by mistake and being pushed by my family. So in this process of searching myself, at some point I landed on international relations, and there is also a writer who had a huge influence on the way I perceived the world, the way I perceived the way I worked my research, and that was you actually.
That's so kind.
It didn't, well, it came later in life, so not in my childhood. Yes, I would like to actually, because when I studied international relations, I realized I'm not as much actually focused on hard policy.
Mm-hmm.
I am more interested in this
Mm-hmm.
soft diplomacy, and I
Mhm.
focused a lot on the role of writers
Mm-hmm.
in soft diplomacy, in diplomacy, in international relations generally,
Mm.
and also in the novel as an instrument for bridging
Mhm.
these different understandings in cultural diplomacy. So I would love to hear if you have something. I'm sure you have, because I've heard also other videos, and you talked about this about the novel and the role of writers in international
Appreciate
relations.
it so much.
Thank
Thank
you.
Thank
you.
you.
So the question was about international relations and the role of soft power, and actually thinking about and building bridges, of course, is so
Yeah.
important to so much
Yeah.
of your work. And how do you build bridges and think about power through your novels?
Yeah. Thank you so much. And, like you, I also journeyed between different disciplines. I think it's a good thing if we are intellectual nomads. We don't settle only in one discipline, and we're open to learning from multiple disciplines. But maybe in terms of bridge building, one thing that we didn't talk about is this gap between written culture and oral culture. There are so many stories, legends, tales that go unnoticed and that are not necessarily covered in books. The reason why I'm mentioning this is because I think as novelists, of course we love stories. Of course we chase stories and we are storytellers. But I genuinely believe we have to become silence tellers as well. And so how to bridge that gap between not only those whose voices we hear and those whose voices we do not hear, but also the gap between written culture and oral culture is very important to me. Maybe because of the way I was raised. I was raised by a grandmother who was a storyteller. She was not a very well-educated woman, my grandmother, only because she'd been pulled out of school in Turkey at the time, and she wholeheartedly believed in women's education. And she genuinely was one of the wisest people I've ever met in my life. I think by her sheer presence, she showed me that you might not have a very, fancy diploma on the wall. You can still be a wise human being. Or just the opposite, you can graduate from a very well-known school, you can still be ignorant, right? So there are different paths to knowledge, there are different paths to wisdom. All I'm trying to say is I love that you connected that with international relations, because this aspect of culture, the complexity of culture, always is ignored, because everyone focuses on realpolitik. That is the coolest thing. And that's why many experts are very, very confused when lots of things happen in many countries, because they don't know the societies. In order to know those societies, in order to know those cultures, we need to read their literature. We need to know their poets. We need to know their writers, their artists. And that aspect is always ignored.
Thank you for the wonderful lecture. You very nicely reminded us about being dominated by bits of information, a wealth of information. And then you talked about how we pursue the humanities, whether we're studying or teaching philosophy, classics, literature, history, then we're trying to organize that into knowledge. But who teaches us wisdom?
So the question was about I don't want to say distinction, about Elif's exploration of the differences across information, knowledge, and wisdom. And the question was, we know perhaps who teaches us information, maybe who teaches us knowledge, although we might want to question that, but the question was who teaches us wisdom.
Yeah, what an intriguing, beautiful question. I think wisdom comes from multiple sources, but we need to pay attention. And actually, during the time of COVID, we went through that existential crisis, did we not? Suddenly, we started paying attention to rivers, to stones, to trees. We did not take them for granted. I genuinely believe we have a lot to learn from nature. We have become so arrogant as a species, as human species, because we think we're the cleverest of all. We are above nature, we're outside nature. We have reduced ourselves to consumers of nature, and our entire connection with nature is cut off. I mentioned there are rivers in the sky very briefly. I want to go back to it because when I was doing this study about the Yazidis, which are one of the oldest cultures in the region, and also listening to older Yazidi women, something struck me, stayed with me very vividly. If you listen to grandmothers who have a lot of wisdom, they say to their grandchildren, who might be, as children do, running up and down, jumping up and down, in the month of April, they tell their grandchildren to tread the earth softly, not to run around harshly, and be careful and be gentle. Why? Because according to the Yazidi beliefs, in the month of April, the earth is pregnant. And so you need to be respectful towards it. Now, to our modern rational mind, this is just superstitious, it's irrational, so we just erase it. But only a culture that has not disconnected itself, that does not see itself above nature, will come up with such a philosophy. So my point is, actually, we have a lot to learn from all these ancient teachings that are already present, that are already there. And I think we have a lot to learn from each other as fellow human beings. But for wisdom to flourish, for wisdom to blossom, the heart has to be in the conversation. Unfortunately, we're being told that if you show your emotions in the public space, it means you are weak. Anyone who shows compassion, that's a weak politician. Anyone who is tearful, oh, that's a weak person. We need to first of all get rid of that dogma. Emotions are not a source of weakness. Emotions are raw energy. They give us power. Very briefly, Toni Morrison has this beautiful essay. She says, it's so simple but so powerful. She says, sometimes I feel so angry. Understandably, she's angry, so much is happening. But the next line in the essay says, and then I go and sit down at my desk and I write. I love it because she takes her anger and turns it into literature. Another person takes their depression, turns it maybe into climate activism. Another person takes their anxiety, turns it into beautiful paintings. So emotions are not the problem. The issue is what do we do with our emotions? But without emotions, without emotional intelligence, I don't think there can be wisdom.
Well, unfortunately, so everybody got warmed up and all the hands have gone up now. Unfortunately, we don't have any more time for questions right now, but also I can't think of a better thought and set of ideas to leave us with after this beautiful lecture that you've given us. So first, I need to extend my thanks again to Elif Shafak on behalf of the School of Advanced Study and the University of London for this beautiful and superb lecture. I need to also thank all of you who have joined us here in person at Senate House, and also to everyone who has joined us online for coming together with us and engaging on this special occasion. And for those of you who are here, we will continue the conversation next door. There will be a reception. I think Elif is going to join us for a little bit. So if you didn't get a chance to answer your question, perhaps she'll have a chance to do so there. Thank you all very much for coming, and please join me again in thanking Elif Shafak for